Hi, I'm Ralph D. Amicis. I'm one of the co-authors of the planetary calendar. These are some of my astrology stories. One of the great things about working in a field which spans thousands of years and an incredible line of tremendously literate people is that there's tremendous stories connected and they get passed down through the ages. So here's just a few of the many stories I've heard over the years. One of our founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, was an important astrologer. In fact, his original booklet that made him famous, Poor Richard's Almanac, was an astrological almanac, very much like our planetary calendar. In fact, in the first edition of that, there's this whole discussion where he's telling how his wife has asked him to start making some money because he spends all of his time with his instruments and his telescope, and it'd be nice if he made some money too, and therefore the publisher of this has agreed to pay him a certain amount per copy if he will fill the columns. And so in the first edition, there's this whole discussion where he runs into his friend on the street, and his friend, who's also an astrologer, is having this argument with him about when the man is going to die. Quite a question to ask in the street. Well, the reason for the question is that he wants to know whether or not he should be paying his bills after a certain date. So it's a very practical question. And throughout history, most of the questions that people have asked related to astrology have been practical questions. In fact, when we go back to the roots of astrology, or the roots that we know about, because it clearly goes before recorded history, the first way in which astrology was used was primarily for the geometry of land, property lines. This goes back to the Greeks and their islands, and the fact that location was so important. And as they started dividing land up, they used the geometry of astrology and astronomy to divide their lands and establish property lines so it could be passed down through the family. The other way in which it was used by the Greeks was as navigation. Navigation has always been key throughout history for any empire. In fact, John Dee, who was Queen Elizabeth I's astrologer, I don't know who her current astrologer is, but Queen Elizabeth I's astrologer was John Dee, and he was very, very famous during his time, and was also famous because of his work in navigation. Remember, this is at the time when England had one of the great navies in the world. And so being able to travel to the New World depended upon, where are the stars? Where are the planets? Where are the ephemerides that tell us when they're going to rise? How far north or south are we? The big issue, of course, was how far east or west are we? The question of longitude. And if you've read about these things, you know that that was the big challenge for many, many years, was how do you determine where you are east to west? See, today we're so used to mathematics being such an important part of our lives. Cell phones wouldn't work without certain algorithms. But in ancient times, for most people, if they lived in a village, they needed the math to count up money, to count up their chickens, to count up their cows. Why are there black sheep? There's black sheep because they would put one black sheep to every 100 sheep, so that when you looked at a flock of sheep, you could count up how many black sheep there were and know how many sheep were in the entire flock. That's the kind of math people dealt with. The math of the stars, the math of the planets, the math of navigation, that was for the literate class. That was for the astrologers. That's why it's so interesting being involved in this field, because we have this wonderful tradition of literate people who have left behind their observations over hundreds and thousands of years. When we look back through history, many of our most famous people, Aristotle, Newton, Kepler, they were all astrologers. Now, with Kepler, he was a special case. He was, of course, the author of the laws of motion related to the motions of the planets. He was a special case because he was first and foremost an astronomer and really a mathematician. And he went to work for Tycho Brahe, the famous Danish astrologer. He was the royal astrologer for Denmark. And Tycho Brahe, though, was a dyed-in-the-wool astrologer. He firmly believed in the field. And Kepler was a bit of a doubter. And one time during an argument between the two, Tycho Brahe, who was a very fiery person, in fact, he wore a fake nose because he had lost the tip of his nose in a fight when he was a young man. It was painted flesh color, so it blended in. Roared at Kepler that to deny astrology is to deny the glory of God. He felt pretty strongly about this. So in basically a bet in which Kepler was setting out to disprove astrology, he was able to get access to the financial records of Germany over an extended period of time, many, 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 many years. And then he compared them against the motions, the relative motions of Jupiter and Saturn. Now, this might have been Tycho Brahe's suggestion, but Jupiter and Saturn are, the two largest planets that people observed at that time. Remember, at that time, people didn't know about Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto. But Jupiter was seen as the planet of expansion, the entrepreneur, the sailing ship. Saturn was seen as the planet of bankers, buildings, solid things. Though Saturn has always been the ruler of great ships. Why? Because Saturn was the ruler of trees, and great ships were made out of trees, of course. Well, he compared these relative motions, and it's basically a 60-year cycle. But Saturn changes the sign about every 2.5 years. Jupiter changes the sign once a year, sometimes even faster. But it basically goes through all 12 signs in 12 years. The Chinese zodiac is based upon the position of Jupiter. So this combination of 2.5 years and 1 year, when you work these two cycles out, comes out to about a 60-year cycle. Does all the data, compares all the numbers, and at the end he realizes that you can track the ups and downs of the German economy by whether or not Saturn and Jupiter are in a good aspect or, quote, a bad aspect to each other. What's a good aspect? A conjunction. A conjunction is when the two planets are next to each other. That's like being right next to your honey. It's a nice position. It's cozy. The next good one is 60 degrees apart. It's a small separation, but it's very harmonious. Then it's 90 degrees apart. That's a square. Well, that's like, one person's walking in one doorway, you're walking in the other doorway. Who's going to give way? Or are you going to bang into each other? The next one is 120 degrees, a trine. That's a very harmonious aspect. Then there's opposition, where they're in the opposite signs from each other. And then you go around to the other side. Once again, the trines, the squares, the sextiles, and conjunction. So over the course of time, these planets are going to be in these relative positions. And when they looked at these aspects, there went the line of the German economy based upon this. We still use these two planets to see how things are going to move along. Are the forces of restriction and the forces of expansion going to work together harmoniously, or are they going to be at loggerheads? Isn't that basically what makes an economy work? Are people going to work together or at cross purposes? Kepler finally admitted to Tycho Brahe, Tycho, you're right, astrology works. Cool story, huh? Computers have done amazing things for the astrologer. At one time, even 30, 40 years ago, if a client showed up and they had already called up and they'd given us the time of birth and the day of birth, the year of birth, the place, and they'd come in and they'd say, I just found out as I was coming here, I'm not born in the AM, I'm born in the PM. Does that matter? And we would say, a little bit, come back tomorrow. Because we would now have to sit down and spend another 2 hours calculating the charts, right? in the ancient past, a lot of astrologers, were working with direct observation of the sky. Though ephemerides, as they're called, our books of charts, were developed over time. The problem is that they would be done at a period of time and there's shift that takes place. So maybe they'd be accurate or maybe they wouldn't. If you were working with ephemerides that were a couple of 100 years old, they may not be quite accurate. So the astrologers, astronomers would have to take personal, measurements. Well, as a modern astrologer, when I want to calculate a chart, I go to my computer, Oh, you're born in the PM, not the AM? No problem. Click, 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 boom, let's start. I have a great story from a colleague of ours, and he does what's called horary astrology, and this is a perfect example of this change. Horary astrology means of the hour. It means the client walks in the door and they say, Ralph, is my ship going to come in this week? Figuratively speaking. And I would do a chart for right then and there. And I would see how the planets played well. Did they, were they working together? Who's the questioner? What's opposing them? And it's a little pattern that you look at. And they call that horary. It means of the hour. Well, the person who was the expert on this was a man named Lilly. And it's his books that really everyone depended upon. And a friend of ours, a colleague, said, people often complain that I'm not using Lilly's method exactly. But Lilly only did a horary for a few years. And he did a lot of it related to ships. Why? Because he was in a dock and people literally would show up and say, Mr. Lilly, is my ship going to come in? Where our colleague has been doing horary for 40 years professionally. He does chart time. Thanks to computers, he's able to calculate them very, very quickly. He has a huge amount more experience with horary than Lilly ever had in a much wider variety of subjects. And you can't work that many years with a tool and have that much experience and not get some serious game. Not get some really deep insights about what means what. Because after all, the person comes in, asks you this question, you calculate it, they call you back later in the week and they say, what you told me, that's exactly how it turned out. Or, hey, I'd like my money back because you weren't even close. Now that probably happens a lot less because astrology really does work. And he's very, very good. But that change is the ability of astrologers today to calculate many, 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 many charts, to relocate them for different places around the globe, to do the charts for two people and then combine them to see how are they going to fit together. Years ago, this would have taken you hours and hours and hours. Thanks to computers today, we are really in a major renaissance in the world of astrology. When astrology and statistics started merging in the 20th century, we had some really interesting studies that went on. One of them was done by an astrologer from California, from Los Angeles, who was actually in the movie business. And what they did is they looked for people who were called time twins. They were born in the same hospital, at the same time, same day, everything, within minutes of each other. And this does happen. It's not that common, but it does happen. And they went looking in all the records for people where this was calculated. And in modern hospitals, it's required that the doctor list the time. That's very important. This is part of your medical information. It's got to be on there. And if you ever need to get your birth certificate and find out what time you're born, the one you get from the clerk may not say it, but if you will ask them to go back and look at the one from the hospital, the original certificate filled out by the doctor, if it's a modern hospital, it will be on there. And that's very helpful when you're calculating your astrological chart. For many years, I'd been told by one of my aunts that I was born at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so I'd been calculating my chart for 2 o'clock in the morning. Turns out when my siblings was born at 2 o'clock in the morning, she didn't remember really. When we went looking for the data, I was born closer to 4. Well, that's an entire sign's difference. That's a big difference in terms of a chart. So you want to look for these things. But in this study, they looked for these time twins. And they followed them years later. They looked at their lives years later, and they found out that there were tremendous similarities. There were greater similarities sometimes than you would find from actual, skin and blood twins, related twins. You'd find a man was, born to parents, he had this many siblings, same number of siblings. He grew up, he went into the same kind of business. He bought a white house with a picket fence. He bought a blue car. He married a woman who did a similar kind of work. And then they had 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, identical to their time twin. It was remarkable. And it wasn't just one case. It was case after case after case after case. Now, they oftentimes lived in different areas, but they tended to cluster in parts of the country. Now, admittedly, maybe the babies were born, obviously, in 2 different, delivery rooms. Maybe that little bit of difference on the planet attributed to the distance that they were later on magnified. You never know. You see, astrology is, in many ways, a location-based art. It's us on the planet, the stars above, the planets above, east, west, south, north. It's very much a location-based type of work. People oftentimes forget that. But these studies really showed there was a lot going on here that we were not aware of. And why it was happening, there's a lot of different reasons people bring up, but it definitely happens. As the 20th century brought on the world of statistics and computers, there was a wonderful astrologer, a French astrologer, who did a great study. And he looked for the position of certain planets in charts. Now, the way an astrological chart is set up is that it's a map. It has an east and a west and a north and a south. It has the sky above and the earth below. What he looked for was for prominent planets in one of 2 spots. Directly overhead, or actually a little to the west of overhead, and to the east, and just a little above the horizon. Now, the horizon, we call the rising sign, is our view onto the world and how we're seen. So in a chart, it is one of the most prominent or most important features in the chart. Most people who know anything about astrology will know their sun sign, their moon sign, and their rising sign. But apparently having that planet just a little above the horizon carries a lot of oomph to it. The other spot is at the midheaven. The midheaven is the flag above our castle. It says this is our theme, you might say. And they found that having the planet just to the west of that, maybe that's the way the flag flew out, was very prominent. And they looked especially for Mars, Jupiter, Venus, the moon, Mercury. And they found, for instance, that great athletes oftentimes had Mars rising just above, in the 10 degrees above the horizon. Not in the first house, that would be below the horizon, but up above the horizon. They found oftentimes that they also had Jupiter just to the west of the midheaven. Now, Mars is physical energy, and Mars really likes the rising. Mars is very related to Aries, and Mars rules Aries. Jupiter is the long muscles, the real ability to see great distances, to throw things great distances, to be optimistic. And if you've ever met world-class athletes, they're tremendously optimistic personalities. They're just bigger than life. Those 2 became very important in terms of great athletes. Novelists oftentimes had the moon rising up in that 10 degrees above the horizon. What's the moon about? The moon is about my personal space, my imagination, my ability to create my level of comfort. When moms, the moon, go shopping, they oftentimes are looking at clothes and saying, how would my child look in that? How would my spouse look in that clothes? They imagine how are they going to create this world. And that's an essential thing for novelists. You have to create this world of characters that you live with. And you have to be able to infuse them with your emotions, and the moon is the emotions. It was interesting that they found that with politicians, oftentimes up in that spot over their head was Pluto. And Pluto is one of these generational planets that relates to large numbers of people and power. So this desire to have power over large numbers of people seems to be a theme that exists in many politicians. And it was amazing when they looked at prominent people how often this was happening. Something like 70 to 80% of the time, they were finding these major planets in significant spots. I remember we were at a conference one time with an expert in the stars, and what we call the fixed stars. And she pointed out that with certain, like, just beyond belief, athletes, even including horses and other types of, animals, that oftentimes they found that right over the midheaven or at the rising, it was aligned with powerful fixed stars. I forget which one of the great horses was aligned with the star for Hercules. That's poetic. But it's very interesting when you combine statistics, because of all the record keeping we do with birth certificates, and you combine astrology, how often we show that it works. A number of years ago, we did our own study, and we looked into the charts of artists. And this comes from my own background as a sculptor and painter. And we started collecting the information of sculptors specifically, though many times other types of artists would send us their information because artists are like that. And we started finding out that there was a big difference in the charts between two-dimensional artists and three-dimensional artists. Now, what was interesting was how much there was a prominence in what was called the 12th house. It's the house of imagination. Now, you expect that imagination is going to be significant in an artist. This is parcel of what the art is about. But it's also, people sometimes misunderstand what imagination is about. It's not just that you're reaching down inside yourself and going, whoosh, this is something new. No, it's about being in touch with the world around you and being able to connect what might seem to someone else unconnected points of light. To understand how, the color of a rose, the sound of a stream, the smile on a person's face, how they might all combine together and then become something new, because in this case the sum is much larger than the parts. It was also interesting because that 12th house has to do with havens. And it had to do with the fact that these people were very comfortable in the haven created by the studio. And that was very interesting, that they felt safe there. It was essential to their creative process. The other thing that was interesting was that the sculptors were much more physical. They typically had much more prominent Mars positions, more prominent Jupiter positions, where the painters tended to have much stronger moons. It's more emotional. And also painting is, after all, a liquid art. The moon rules the seas. So the differences between these was very interesting. It was quite an education for us at the time, because we're both artists, and we knew a lot of the people whose charts we were reading. So it became very important in terms of how we understood how modern people live in a world and how their astrology expresses itself.
Can you say something about how we unexpectedly found indicators of this person worked in a textile medium, this one worked in stone, this one worked in...
when you look at the planets and you look at the signs, there's actually an entire system that talks about materials. In other words, steel is ruled by Mars, right? Fabrics are ruled by Venus. Pens are ruled by Mercury, communication. It was interesting as we worked on these charts, we realized that that prominence showed up in the charts. So people had very strong Venus, for instance, and maybe Venus and Saturn, since Saturn is about patterns and Venus is about beauty and color. They were the people who worked in textiles. We also found that people who had strong moons or a lot of water in their chart and yet also had strong earth, the earth signs being Virgo, Taurus, Capricorn, that these were the people who worked in clay, which is, after all, earth with water. Right? People with very strong Saturn, Saturn is crystal, they were the people who worked in stone. People who had very strong Mars and very strong fire signs being Aries, Leo, Sagittarius, they were the ones who worked in steel, fire, flames, welding. So it was very specific about the materials that they felt most comfortable with. And of course, glass has a certain mercurial quality to it. It's like with mirrors, they're playful. You're looking at a solid object and yet you can see through it. Mercury loves to play. Mercury oftentimes relates to children, and children love mirrors. That's why fun houses exist. The concept of the sun sign. You know, you're in a bar, you meet a nice girl, and you say, hey, what's your sign? So I guess it's a little outdated, but it still happens. That concept, person's a Leo, this person's an Aries, is actually relatively recent. It only started in the 17 and 1800s, and it started primarily with one astrologer. His last name was Leo. And what he did was, it was during the Industrial Revolution, where things were being automated. And what he did was he automated astrology. He would write an interpretation for the sun in Leo. He'd write an interpretation for Mercury in Virgo. He'd write an interpretation for Mercury in Libra. And he'd write them for all the other signs too, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, and he'd have them on cards. And when a client would come in, they would calculate the chart, and his assistants would pull these cards out and put them down, and then they would copy them down into a report, essentially. So his assistants did not need to know astrology in order to create this report. And then at the end, the astrologer would sit down with the report, and they would add in, the sun is trine Sagittarius. The sun in Leo is trine Sagittarius, Jupiter and Sagittarius. The Mercury is conjunct the Venus. What does this mean? But this became the automated system. And it actually became very popular with people. And it gave people a way in which they could identify, oh, well, I'm born in Leo. That's why I am the way I am. We always want reasons why we are the way we are. It's not just because our mom loved us and our dad loved us and they fed us. We want other reasons. Why am I different from my siblings? Why am I different from my cousins? And we had the same parents. Our parents were related. Why? It's in life, we want to have reasons. Why am I having a hard time now? Or why am I having a great time now? That's why astrology continues to be popular. It tells us about the cycles of life. And it lets us know that, hey, it's not just us. Everyone's going through these transits. So this concept of the sun sign became increasingly popular through, of course, newspapers. And even today, one of the most read sections of any newspaper is the astrology column. You can admit it, you probably read yours today or this week. But this is a new concept. Before then, an astrologer wouldn't say, oh, well, you're born in Leo. They'd say, oh, well, this person has their sun in Leo. But that might not even be the most prominent thing. They might be focused on the fact that they had Jupiter rising. You have to be careful about eating too much and getting too fat. You have to exercise more. Or they might be more concerned with the fact that they had Venus at the 4th house. It's called the IC. Ah, this will be a woman who's a great cook. It's going to make a beautiful home. This was the most prominent planet, the sun. What's interesting about that is that in the studies in which they looked about prominent planets related to career, they found that it's very true that if you have a prominent Jupiter, you will be guided towards certain types of careers. A prominent Mars leads you towards certain careers. The only planet in which this was not true is not necessarily what we call a planet. We call it a light. It was the sun. The sign in which you find the sun in a person's chart actually seems to have no real influence in terms of what career you choose. Interesting. And yet, everyone knows their sun sign.